14:45 on June 27, 2025, a Ukrainian MiG-29 of the 41st Tactical Aviation Brigade snapped into a sharp left bank, cockpit lights flaring red as his weapon system spat out voltage warnings. The strike run toward the Russian drone plant had been routine, almost too routine, until everything changed in an instant. The silence of the headset shattered when the radar warning receiver wailed alive. An S-300 battery had locked on, its search beam reaching out across 95 kilometers, fixing him in its crosshairs. The pilot shoved the MiG down to 500 feet, skimming the earth to hide in the folds of the terrain, while his weapon system clawed through its startup cycle. Each GBU-39 had to catch a GPS signal, align its inertial nav, and handshake with the jury-rigged interface. It was supposed to be a half-minute process. 2 minutes had passed, and the bombs were still silent. At 14:48, the last bomb finally blinked green. On the iPad, the target resolved. An enemy drone plant buried 350 kilometers inside occupied territory, turning out 40 Shahed 136 a week. Intelligence warned of a Krasukha 4 parked nearby, its 500-watt jammers clawing at the GPS spectrum. The pilot glanced at his gauges. Fuel reserve 2,100 kilometers, enough for one shot and a clean exit if everything went right. Once the bombs were away, he'd only have 18 minutes over hostile ground before bingo fuel snapped him back. The S-300 broadened its sweep, and SA-15 to the southeast began humming into the picture. In 6 minutes, he had to push to 15,000 feet for the release, an altitude that would paint him bright for every radar and missile in the zone. From 15,000 feet, the GBU-39s could glide more than 100 kilometers, but first their guidance brains had to punch through the wall of jamming, electromagnetic wash strong enough to fry civilian hardware in an instant. Then the cockpit shuddered. Voltage spiked to 31 volts, holding for 3 long seconds before the regulator fought it down. The improvised pylons beneath the bombs were sucking 32 amps through wiring rated for 20. The pilot shoved the throttles forward, the twin RD-33s answering with a roar, 18,300 pounds of thrust each. The MiG knifed ahead, crossing into the contested zone. At 14:51, every warning light flared at once. S-400 radars from Melitopol, mobile SA-15S pivoting to intercept, and the first pulses of Krasukha jamming seared the GPS spectrum. In 19 minutes, he'd find out whether 4 precision bombs strapped to Soviet wings with salvaged tank parts could survive the most lethal air defense network outside Moscow. At 15:15, he rolled the MiG hard right, slipping into the 8-kilometer seam between overlapping S-300 coverage zones. Ukrainian intelligence had carved a path along 2 ridge lines. 7 minutes of low-level radar-dodging flight toward the target. One wrong turn and he'd be dead center in an SA-15's kill envelope. The gap existed for only one reason: simple physics. The S-400 near Melitopol couldn't see below 800 feet at that distance. The Earth's curve hid him. The S-300 batteries were tuned for high-altitude targets, leaving gaps at extreme low level. But this corridor demanded perfection. 2 kilometers left and the Western S-300 would lock. 3 kilometers right and he'd fly straight into an SA-15 patrol. One slip meant instant death. At 15:18, the radar warning receiver screamed new activity. A mobile SA-15 had halted, its crew suspicious of the seam in their coverage. The 9 S-36 search radar lit up, hunting exactly what he was doing, testing the flaw in their deployment. He shoved the MiG lower, skimming just 400 feet above a dry riverbed, fuselage grazing power lines missing from mission maps. At 15:22, he yanked the MiG into a 4G climb toward 15,000 feet. Instantly, the radar warning receiver flared. Multiple fire control radars had him in their sights. The S-400's Gravestone radar cut through Ukrainian jamming with 350 watts of raw power, bathing the MiG in enough electromagnetic energy to make its radome burn. He had 90 seconds to hit the release point before crossing into the S-400's kill zone, where 4A and 6E missiles could reach him in just 24 seconds. Timing was everything. 45 minutes earlier, Ukrainian Su-24s had loosed harm missiles at the Talmak radars, knocking them offline, buying him this narrow window. Electronic warfare teams flooded the battle space with ghost signals. Phantom strike aircraft advancing from the northwest. Defenses shifted to meet the illusion, never seeing the lone MiG slipping in from another angle. Every move of the operation had been scripted to buy him this, a 90-second window to strike. Leveling at release altitude, he glanced at the gauges. Just 12 minutes of fuel left for the return leg. Below, the GBU-39s ticked through their final checks. GPS receivers locked onto 5 satellites with 3-meter accuracy. The target coordinates were set. Everything was ready. He scanned the tactical display one last time. The nearest SA-15 sat 41 kilometers to the southwest, just beyond range, but close enough to pounce if he delayed. The S-400's emissions told their story. A launch was imminent, but the math favored him. Their missiles would take 30 seconds to arrive. 30 seconds after his bombs were already gone. For 10 minutes, the Krasukha 4 parked near the target had been spewing GPS jamming across the L1 and L2 bands, half a kilowatt of raw interference saturating the airwaves. The Russians were pouring noise into the sky, trying to blind anything that needed satellites to see, but it didn't matter. In 60 seconds, he'd find out if American engineers had really built the GBU-39 to survive the planet's nastiest electronic storms. The fate of Ukrainian civilians, relying on these strikes to halt the drone raids, rested on 37 kilograms of explosive and the tiny circuit boards that would steer them through the invisible maelstrom. At 15:28, he released the first GBU-39. The MiG jolted as 250 pounds dropped from the starboard pylon. Its GPS receiver instantly hammered by interference on every channel. Within 200 milliseconds, the bomb's computer flagged the noise floor as critical and shifted smoothly to inertial navigation. 82 kilometers away, the Krasukha 4 crew had no idea their jamming had just outsmarted itself. 6 seconds later, he dropped the second from the port pylon, then the third off the center line, then the fourth. Each weapon snapped its wings open exactly 2.7 seconds after release, shifting from dumb weight to high-efficiency glider with about a 20-to-1 LD. Their guidance suites instantly computed staggered approach vectors so the 4 would converge from different angles, forcing any point defense system to choose which one to try and stop. At 15:29:15, the nearest battery fired 2 9M9s. Their intercept solution came up just 45 seconds too late, long after the MiG would vanish behind the terrain. Physics and geometry had already decided the fight. The missiles would hunt nothing but ground clutter before they could reach him. Meanwhile, the GBU-39s cut through the air at 180 meters per second. Their guidance computers updated 20 times per second, cross-checking accelerometer readings against preloaded waypoints etched into hardened memory. At 15:31, GPS signals flickered through the jamming. The bombs updated their positions, confirming they stayed within 8 meters of their planned trajectories. Even relying solely on inertial navigation, they had held their course through the planet's harshest electronic battlefield. At 15:32:44, the first bomb locked onto its target. Its uncooled infrared seeker detected the assembly building's metal roof, radiating heat differently from nearby structures. The onboard algorithm matched the thermal signature to reference imagery with 94% confidence. The bomb fine-tuned its terminal dive, tail fins adjusting to hit at a 68-degree angle for maximum penetration. 28 seconds later, the second weapon slammed into the electronics workshop, where Iranian-designed autopilots were programmed for specific targets. Without this capability, finished drones were little more than expensive model airplanes, useless for precision strikes. The bomb punched through the reinforced roof and detonated amid workbenches stacked with circuit boards, laptops, and programming gear. The overpressure wave fried fragile electronics, while shards of metal shredded everything that survived the blast. At 15:33:41, the third GBU-39 slammed into the storage warehouse. Intelligence had pegged 15 to 20 completed Shahed 136 drones inside, each packed with 40 kilograms of explosives. When the American bomb struck, it triggered a chain reaction, turning the warehouse into a roaring secondary explosion. The combined blast didn't just wipe out the inventory, it obliterated the entire logistics chain, keeping Southern drone operations running. Fuel, spare parts, and maintenance gear worth millions of rubles vanished in seconds. The fourth bomb followed up, double tapping whatever remained. The Krasukha 4 crew only understood their failure when the explosion shook the target complex. Their system had done exactly what it was built to do, saturate GPS bands with interference that should have sent the bombs careening into empty fields. They had no idea the GBU-39s were built to outwit Soviet-era jammers. Decades of American study on Russian systems had been folded into every circuit. Now, all that mattered was getting the MiG pilot home, and the Russians weren't about to make it easy. At 15:34, he leveled off at 400 feet with 750 kilograms of fuel left. The tactical display read 180 kilometers to Ukrainian airspace, 12 minutes if he held optimal cruise. Behind him, secondary explosions punched smoke columns 3,000 feet into the sky as munitions and fuel supplies joined the inferno. The SPO-15 warning receiver screamed. Multiple SA-15 batteries had launched, missiles streaking toward him. The 9M9S hit Mach 2.8 almost instantly, but he was already ahead. At his speed and low altitude, the terrain would hide him before the missiles reached their 15-kilometer envelope. The river valley ahead offered a natural radar shield, 45 seconds to vanish from their sights. Russian air defense vectored two Su-35S fighters from Berdyansk to intercept, but the geometry was against them. It would take 8 minutes to reach his current position. By then, he'd be 75 kilometers closer to friendly airspace. Their R-77s had range, but locking onto a target skimming at 400 feet through ground clutter was beyond their radars. He stayed low, knowing climbing would only make him visible.